Widower rancher with 2 kids hired a mountain girl for $3, but she had his wife's voice. Luke Avery didn't believe in omens, not when his wife died, not when winter swallowed the land and left him with 2 small children and a cabin full of silence. So when he paid $3 for a mountain girl, quiet, sunburnt, unwanted by the crowd, he told himself it was practical. She'd cook, clean, help with the kids, nothing more. But then she spoke, just once, and the sound of her voice shattered something inside him because it wasn't just familiar. It was identical to his wife's, the one he buried 3 winters ago. This is not a tale of magic. It's a story of memory, grief, and how the past sometimes walks back into your life, wearing a different face but carrying the same soul. So stay until the end. Not everything is what it seems, and some truths only reveal themselves when you're ready to hear them. Comment below which part of this story echoes something in your own life. And if he didn't mean to buy anyone that day. Luke Avery had ridden into town for flour, bullets, and a new kettle to replace the one with a broken handle. What he didn't expect was to walk away with a woman no one seemed to want, especially not the kind with mud-stained boots and a face turned to the ground. The auction wasn't official. It was just a quiet deal behind the saloon, the way things often happened in the parts of the West that the law forgot. A rancher had brought her down from the mountains, said she owed him debt for food and fire. No name, no kin, no price until someone asked. Luke didn't speak up at first. He watched from the edge, arms crossed, fingers twitching against his worn leather belt. The men standing around were looking for youth, for beauty, for voices that sang sweet and hands that cooked clean. This woman, she just stood there, wrapped in a faded green shawl that hung like a second skin, eyes hidden behind loose strands of hair. Silent. $3, Luke said before he could stop himself. The crowd turned. A few men chuckled. One said, "Suit yourself," and just like that the deal was done. She didn't look surprised. She simply nodded once, walked to his wagon, and climbed in without a word. On the ride back, she sat in the back beside the sacks of grain and blankets, her fingers clenched around the hem of her skirt. June, Luke's youngest, peeked over her shoulder more than once. Sam, older and more guarded, stayed pressed close to his father. "She looks like Mama," June whispered, barely audible over the creaking wheels. Luke said nothing. It was only when they turned off the trail and the cabin came into view, that familiar outline against the distant ridge, that the woman's eyes lifted. She looked at the porch, the rocking chair, the lantern still hanging by a bent nail. And still she said nothing. Inside, she didn't ask where things went. She found the firewood, stoked the coals, washed her hands before touching the pot. By the time Luke came back from feeding the horses, she had a kettle boiling and a loaf of bread warming near the hearth. No one told her where anything was. She just knew. That night Luke couldn't sleep. He lay with his eyes open, listening to the unfamiliar silence that somehow felt known. She slept in the room that used to belong to a helper, though his wife had often used it too, on nights when fever stole her warmth or grief made her distance herself from everything she loved. At breakfast, she poured coffee without asking. Sam stared. June tried to braid her own hair the way the woman wore hers, low and loose. Luke just watched, quietly. By the third morning he asked, "What's your name?" She was spooning oatmeal into bowls. She didn't flinch, didn't glance up, just finished setting the last bowl down before turning to face him fully. "Eden," she said, and the room dropped into stillness. Luke's fingers clenched around his mug. The heat no longer registered. He hadn't heard that name in 4 years. Eden was the name no one dared speak in this house anymore. It was the name etched on the stone behind the chapel near the frozen creek. It was the whisper the wind carried through the valley on nights he thought the past might come calling. Now it was here, in flesh and bone, standing barefoot on his kitchen floor. She didn't explain. He didn't ask again, but something shifted. Like a storm changing direction without warning, like remembering the taste of a meal long forgotten just by scent. She moved through the house like she'd known it in another life. Or perhaps, and this haunted him, she had. That night he found her folding a quilt on the porch. Not just any quilt. The one Eden, his Eden, had stitched the winter Sam was born. Each square sewn with care, marked with initials only someone inside their story would recognize. "Where'd you find that?" he asked. "In the trunk," she said. "It was damp. I aired it out." He nodded, but inside something unspoken twisted. Who was she really? A stranger who had guessed too well. A woman with shadows in her voice. Or someone the world had tried to bury, but who found her way back with a new name, and a silence loud enough to make him remember. He didn't know yet, but he couldn't look away. He wanted to tell himself it was all coincidence. That Eden was just a name common enough, biblical even. That the way she tucked Sam's scarf tighter before he ran outside, or stirred the soup twice counterclockwise before tasting, or sat in his late wife's rocker like it had always been hers. That those were just things anyone might do. But the details piled up like snow on the roof, silent, weighty, impossible to ignore. The next day, Luke watched from the barn as she walked barefoot across the frostbitten yard, carrying laundry to the line. The morning sun hit her face, and for a split second she turned just right, the same tilt of the chin, the same mouth that used to hum when no one was listening. A memory slammed into him. Eden humming that tune while brushing June's hair, pausing to kiss the child's temple when she flinched from the knots. It wasn't just the sound. It was the rhythm, the breath between lines. And now this woman, this stranger with his wife's name, had picked up that very melody as she passed the hallway earlier, like it lived somewhere in her bones. Later that afternoon, Luke reached for the old Bible kept under the floorboard. Not because he needed prayer, but because tucked inside was a photo. Faded, cracked, barely visible, but enough to show Eden, her eyes squinting in the sun, standing with Sam on her hip and June grabbing at her dress hem. He brought it into the main room, set it beside the lamp, and watched. She noticed it after supper. Her hand froze mid-wipe across the table. "Where'd this come from?" she asked softly. Luke leaned back in his chair. "You tell me." She looked at it a long time. Her face unreadable, but something in her throat moved, a hard swallow, the kind you take when a truth comes knocking. Then she said nothing, just walked away, shoulders square. The days that followed were wrapped in quiet tension, like the breath before a storm. Luke didn't ask more questions, and Eden didn't offer answers. But answers found their own way into the spaces between their silences, and that was worse. It was in the way she reached for the coffee can without searching, knowing exactly which cabinet held it. The way she turned the knob on the old stove, not the way most newcomers did, fumbling with the sticky hinge, but with the light tap that kept it from jamming. She swept dust from the same corner his wife used to fuss about. When she sang, under her breath, it was never anything loud, never deliberate, just murmurs of lullabies that had long gone silent in this house. It would have been easy to dismiss, if not for the night Luke passed by the children's room and heard her whispering. A story about a fox with one red paw who tricked a bear to save its cub. It wasn't a common tale. In fact, it wasn't one Luke had ever heard anywhere but here, from Eden's mouth, during those bitter winters when she made up stories to distract the kids from how cold their toes were. He stood outside the door that night, hand pressed to the wood. Inside, Eden's voice curled around the words like she had spoken them hundreds of times before, like she wasn't recalling them but reliving them. When the story ended, he didn't go in, just walked back to the porch and sat there, gripping the edge of the chair like it might float him away from what he was beginning to accept. The next morning, he searched the attic. Not for confrontation, for proof, for something real that would tell him what the hell was going on. He found the chest, the same one his Eden, used to keep her keepsakes in. Most of it had been untouched for years. Except now, the lid creaked open easier than he remembered. And on top, neatly folded, was the shawl she used to wear, the green one with the frayed hem. Below it, tucked into a side pocket, a dried lavender bundle still held its scent. He picked it up, held it to his nose, and time slipped. He staggered back, breathing heavy, fingers trembling. This woman, this Eden, either was her somehow, or knew her life with an intimacy that shouldn't be possible. He didn't believe in reincarnation. He didn't believe in miracles, but he knew grief. And grief had ways of making the impossible feel real. That night he confronted her. "You ever been here before?" he asked, leaning against the doorway as she scrubbed potatoes at the sink. She didn't turn, just kept scrubbing. "No," she said softly, "not in this life." Luke stared, heart thudding. What the hell does that mean? Eden finally looked at him. "It means I know things I shouldn't, but I never claim to be someone I'm not." He didn't push. He couldn't. Something in her eyes warned him not of danger but of damage. Like pressing further would unravel something delicate that barely held together. But as he stood there, he noticed the way her knuckles whitened as she gripped the cloth. The way she blinked too slowly, like holding back the flood. That voice, that tone, it wasn't imitation. It was memory, muscle deep. And suddenly, Luke didn't know whether he was chasing answers or running from them. He didn't sleep that night. Not because of fear, but because something more unsettling had taken root. The feeling that the ground beneath his life was shifting, ever so slightly, but constantly. In the quiet hours past midnight, Luke found himself in the study, staring at a stack of journals Eden had once kept. They were half-filled, barely legible in places, and most hadn't been touched since her burial. His fingers traced the edges, reluctant to open, terrified to confirm. He flipped to one entry. no date, just a sentence that clawed through his ribs. The children always calm down when I hum the fox song. He closed the book and stared at the ceiling, trying to convince himself it didn't mean what it clearly meant. The next morning, Eden moved through the kitchen with the same efficiency as always. She tied June's braid the way Eden used to, loose at the bottom, tucked just behind the ear. She scraped burnt bits off the bottom of the pan using a trick only his wife had used backhanded with salt and coffee grounds. Luke didn't speak. He watched. He counted. He listened. She whistled while sweeping, off-key but familiar, the same tune Eden would whistle when she thought no one could hear her from the porch. At dinner, Sam asked a question he hadn't asked in over a year. "Do you believe in spirits, Pa?" Luke set his fork down. "Why?" "Because sometimes I think Mama still walks around here. I dream of her, but it's not like before. It's like she's waiting." Eden didn't flinch, didn't speak. Just reached for the bread and passed it silently. Later that night, as snow began to fall, Luke sat beside her on the porch. The wind howled low, like a breath drawn in and never released. "I buried her," he said, not looking at her. "My hands dug the dirt. I placed the stone myself." "I know," Eden whispered. "How can you know?" he asked, voice sharper than intended. She paused. "Because I remember the cold of that day, and the way the wind carried June's cry into the trees. I remember your hands." Luke turned to her, jaw tight. "Are you her?" "No." "Then who are you?" "I don't have the answer you want," she said. "But I know I was meant to be here, with you. With them, this place." She looked out over the snow-covered yard. "Feels like a place I left, not one I found." The fire inside the house cracked. June laughed in her sleep. Luke looked at Eden, really looked. She didn't look exactly like his wife. The face was different, the eyes darker, the hands rougher. But the way she moved in this world, the way she belonged to it, was the same. Familiar like an old song you forgot you knew. He wanted to scream, to shake her, to demand answers she clearly didn't have. Instead, he said the only thing that made sense. "Don't lie to me." "I haven't," she said, "not once." And maybe she hadn't. Maybe it was the world that had lied, the part of it that said some things couldn't come back, couldn't be remembered, couldn't live again. But Luke knew grief, and he was starting to know wonder. And the two were beginning to overlap in ways he wasn't ready for, but couldn't look away from anymore. The knock came at dusk, sharp, impatient, and far too loud for a neighborly visit. Luke opened the door to find two men he didn't recognize, boots caked with dried mud, coats stiff with wind and sweat. They didn't give names, just said they were looking for someone, a woman mountain-born about yay tall, might go by Mary, M., or not much at all. Luke said he hadn't seen anyone like that. The taller one looked past him, eyes drifting toward the firelight inside. The shorter one smiled, cold and sharp. "Mind if we take a look around?" Luke's hand drifted toward the rifle resting against the doorframe. "Mind if I say no?" They left after that, not hurried, not angry, just calm, too calm. Luke closed the door and turned to find Eden already wrapping June in extra wool. "You know them," he said. "I know what they do," she replied. He didn't press. The fear in her eyes was answer enough. By nightfall, the children were bundled tight and the wagon hitched. Eden packed food without being told. Sam clutched the toy horse Luke had carved him last winter. June refused to let go of Eden's hand. They rode into the cold, deeper into the forest, up toward the ridge where the snow lay heavier and the paths went unwatched. Luke had only taken that trail once before, during the worst drought in years. Back then, it had nearly killed his horse. This time, they went on foot once the wagon couldn't pass. Eden carried June for miles, never once asking to stop. Sam trudged beside her, eyes locked forward like a soldier too young to know what he was braving. Luke led the way, but every so often he'd glance back, not to check their pace, but to watch how easily Eden adjusted June's scarf, how she whispered little nothings into her ear when the child began to cry. By the time they reached an abandoned trapper's cabin, barely 4 walls and half a roof, the moon hung low and bitter. Inside it was cold and smelled of pine rot, but they built a fire. They found old pelts to line the floor. Luke wrapped the children together, one under each arm, and for a while they slept. Eden stayed awake. So did Luke. In the quiet he asked, "What did you do to make them chase you?" She stared at the fire, eyes unfocused. "I told the truth." "That's it. That's all it ever takes." Later that night Sam stirred. Cold sweat on his brow, teeth clenched, caught in a nightmare. Eden didn't wake him. She just reached over, placed her hand gently on his chest, and hummed. Not a song Luke knew, not one Eden had ever sung. It was something older, maybe, something deeper. Sam's breathing slowed. The next morning they moved again, higher up, toward the glacier shelf where Luke knew a hunting shack stood. They walked through snow that reached their knees, past trees that moaned in the wind. At one point, June slipped on a rock hidden beneath the frost and cried out. Eden scooped her up, checked her ankle, kissed her forehead. "You're strong," she said. "But even strong people get tired. That's okay." June nodded, burrowed her face into Eden's shoulder, and sighed. Luke watched from a distance, a strange ache blooming in his chest. Not pain, something gentler, something dangerous. Hope. They reached the shack by nightfall. It was sturdier than the last place, still smelled of old tobacco and dried jerky. There they built another fire. There, Sam asked Eden to sit next to him while he drew in the soot on the stone floor. He drew 4 stick figures. One big man, one small boy, one little girl, and one woman with long hair. He handed her the stick. "Your turn." She didn't hesitate. She drew a house, then a heart, then looked up and said, "I think we're almost home." And no one, not even Luke, corrected her. The morning after they reached the shack, the wind had settled. The kind of stillness that comes only after something big has passed, a storm, a truth, a decision. Snow clung to the trees like wool, and the air was so clean it almost hurt to breathe. Inside, Eden stirred the ashes back into flame while Luke chopped kindling. June sat in Eden's lap, watching every move of her hands. Sam practiced tying knots with a bit of spare rope, his brow furrowed in concentration. It was the kind of quiet that felt earned, like all 4 of them were building something invisible, breath by breath. Luke watched Eden from the corner of his eye. She moved with the children like she'd always been there, not trying to replace anyone, just present. She didn't force warmth. She didn't overcorrect. When Sam grew frustrated with the knots, she didn't rush to fix them. She just handed him the rope again, said, "Try slower." It was a simple thing, but it stopped Luke cold. That was exactly what his Eden, had said once, when Sam was trying to whittle for the first time. Same voice, same cadence, same faith that the child would get there on his own. He turned away, pretending to tend the fire, because the emotion rising in his throat was too much, too fast. That afternoon, Eden taught June how to braid strips of fabric. She didn't explain why, just said, "It's good to know how to make something out of what you've got." When June handed her the crooked braid with pride in her eyes, Eden tied it around her wrist like it was the finest thing she'd ever owned. Sam offered her one of his drawings, a rough sketch of their cabin back home, the old one. Eden smiled. "You remembered the window I used to sit at," she said. Sam blinked. "You mean you?" Eden caught herself. "I mean that's where the light was best." Luke watched the exchange in silence. He should have stepped in, clarified, but the boy didn't ask again. He just nodded like he already knew. That evening, Luke found himself pacing outside the shack. The snow crunched under his boots, and breath came in clouds. He tried to shake off the question that had begun to haunt him more than any outlaw or blizzard. What if this was her? Not the same flesh, not the same face, but the same soul, the same weight behind the way she touched things gently like they might vanish. The same tone when she warned the kids to watch their step or the wind'll take your toes. The same pause before laughter, as if joy was something sacred. He'd buried a body. He said goodbye. But what if goodbye wasn't the end? What if some part of her had found its way back, not as a ghost, but as something braver? The wind picked up. He turned back toward the shack and saw her through the window, seated with both children, reading by lantern glow. And something in him shifted, not like a door opening, more like a lock clicking loose, quiet, certain. That night while the children slept, Luke and Eden sat by the fire again. No questions, no accusations, just shared silence. After a while he said, "You don't need to stay." She didn't look at him. "I know. But you haven't tried to leave." "I haven't wanted to." He leaned forward, elbows on knees. "They're starting to see you as someone they know." She nodded, "And I'm starting to." He stopped, the words wouldn't come. Eden didn't press. Instead, she said, "I never expected to be seen. Not again, not like this." Luke finally turned to her. "Whoever you are, you're giving them something I thought they'd never have again." "What's that?" He didn't hesitate. Safety, laughter. The chance to call someone mama without flinching. Eden's eyes shimmered in the firelight. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The next day they boiled snow for water, caught a rabbit in a snare, and made stew. June helped stir. Sam learned to skin, his hands shaking less with each slice. In the middle of the day, a hawk circled overhead. Eden stepped outside, squinting at the sky. She whispered something under her breath, a prayer maybe, or a memory. Luke stood beside her, watching. "They'll come looking again," she said. "I know. You could hand me over." "I won't." She looked at him then, really looked. "Why not?" "Because they'd be taking more than just you." She breathed out slowly. So what are we? Luke considered the question. His gaze drifted to the shack, the smoke curling from its chimney, the tiny fingerprints smudged on the frost-covered window. A start, he said. Maybe that's enough. She nodded, and for the first time since he'd met her, her shoulders dropped, just a little. Like a weight she'd carried so long she forgot it was there had finally begun to loosen. And in that moment, no papers, no vows, no blood ties a family began. Not because they had to, but because they chose to. Because something about the way they moved through the world made more sense when they moved through it together. They had only been in the mountain shack for a few days, but already the space had begun to feel less like a shelter and more like a cocoon. A strange kind of safety sewn from necessity, snow, and something softer, unspoken. That illusion shattered one morning over breakfast. Sam had been quiet, stirring his porridge in slow circles. Then, just as Eden leaned in to wipe a smudge of ash from his cheek, he said it, so casually, so naturally, it hit like a slap. "Thanks, Mama." The air in the room froze. Even the fire seemed to hush. Eden blinked, her hand suspended midair. June looked up, chewing slower. Luke stood. The sound of the chair scraping against the wood floor was louder than thunder. "No," he said, not angry, not loud, just firm. Final. Sam's eyes darted to him, confused. "But she's not your mother." The silence that followed was unbearable. Luke didn't mean for it to come out that way. But something inside him twisted hard, something raw and wounded and not ready. Eden didn't speak. She simply stood, nodded once, and stepped outside into the snow. She didn't return for hours. Luke stayed inside, pacing, fixing things that didn't need fixing, a loose floorboard, a leaky seam in the roof. Sam sulked in a corner. June clung to her drawing, which featured Eden holding both of their hands. When night fell and Eden still hadn't returned, Luke went looking. He found her sitting by a ridge just below a pine tree, knees pulled to her chest. She didn't turn when he approached. "I'm sorry," he said. "I know." She was their mother, he added, unsure if he was justifying or apologizing. "I didn't ask to be that," Eden whispered. "But they keep offering it." Luke sat beside her, careful not to touch. "They miss her." "So do you." Silence stretched between them. Then Eden said something that made Luke stop breathing. "June still curls her left foot when she sleeps. Sam dreams loud, always has. You used to read them stories from a book with half the pages torn out." He turned to her slowly. "That book was burned," he said, "years ago." "I know," she replied, "but I still remember the last story you read from it. The one about the wolf who was really a dog." Luke stood abruptly, the world tilting under his boots. Back inside the cabin, he pulled open the trunk he'd carried with him all these miles. Buried deep beneath extra clothes and oilcloth was a leather-bound notebook, cracked at the spine, pages yellowed, corners curled. It had once belonged to Eden. His Eden. He hadn't opened it in years. He turned the pages slowly, stopping at a scribble he barely remembered. A line about Sam's snore pattern, the way June counted raindrops before sleeping, the fox story. And then, scrawled near the back, "I hum when I'm scared. Not because I'm brave." Because it's the only thing that sounds like me." He froze. That same phrase, word for word, was what Eden had whispered to June just days ago, when a tree branch snapped outside the cabin and the little girl had jumped in fright. Luke sat down hard, the book falling from his hands. She couldn't know that. She couldn't have read this, unless he didn't confront her, not then. Instead, he began to watch differently. It wasn't about the resemblance anymore. It wasn't about voice or touch or lullabies. It was in the way she moved toward pain instead of away from it. The way she held still when June sobbed, instead of rushing to fix it. The way she let Sam cry once, then made him chop kindling after, not to punish, but to let his hands remember they were strong. That's what Eden used to do, not mother from instinct but from knowing. From love sharpened by fire, not fantasy. He found himself wondering, what if love didn't die with the body? What if memory was more than just thought? What if it was legacy, printed on the soul? One evening, while the children slept, Eden placed the worn quilt around Luke's shoulders. He looked up at her, eyes heavy. "They called you mother," he said. "I know. And I didn't stop them tonight. I know. Because you didn't correct them either." This time she didn't respond. Instead, she knelt beside the fire, placed her hand on the old kettle and said, "They needed someone, and I wanted to be chosen." Luke's voice was barely a whisper. "I think you already were." And for the first time in years, the house didn't feel haunted. It felt whole. The fire crackled between them, its glow casting shadows across the worn wooden floor, dancing gently along Eden's cheekbones. Her face looked different in that light, not softer but clearer. Not someone unfamiliar, but someone returned. And for Luke, that difference mattered. She didn't need to be identical. She didn't need to explain miracles or memory. She just needed to be here, and somehow, every part of her being here made the house feel like a home again. Luke leaned forward, elbows on his knees, letting the silence breathe between them. There was no rush now. The urgency had shifted. It wasn't about what was lost anymore, it was about what was becoming. "I used to think healing meant forgetting," he murmured. "Letting go, moving on." Eden's eyes lifted toward him, calm but glistening. "And now," she asked, "I think maybe healing is letting it live beside you, letting it stay, just not letting it own you." Eden nodded, slow and deep, like the kind of agreement that came from having learned the same lesson, painfully, repeatedly, quietly. She reached into the satchel she always kept close and pulled out a small cloth bundle. Luke hadn't seen it before. "I was going to give this to June when the time was right," she said, "but maybe you should see it first." Inside the cloth was a tiny wooden pendant, nothing fancy, carved in the shape of a leaf. Familiar. Luke's breath caught. He'd made one just like it, years ago, a matching set. One for Eden, one for June. The night his wife died, only one had been found. "Where did you get this?" he asked, voice low, unsure if he wanted the answer. Eden didn't blink. "It was left behind. I kept it because it was the only thing that felt like home when everything else turned to ash." She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. Luke reached for the pendant, his fingers brushing hers. "I buried her," he said again, not in denial this time, but as a truth that needed re-speaking. Eden nodded. "You buried a body." The implication lingered, chilling and strange. Luke didn't challenge it. He didn't want to anymore. That night he couldn't sleep. He stepped outside, stood under the open sky, and let the cold remind him he was still alive. The stars were thick, brighter than he'd seen in years, and the silence was sacred. From behind him, a voice. I remember the sky looked like this the night we lost the calf, the one with the crooked leg. He turned. Eden stood barefoot on the step, arms wrapped around herself, breath visible in the air. He didn't ask how she knew. He just nodded. I called her Clover, he said. You did, Eden replied, then smiled, faint and fleeting. The smile hit Luke in the gut, not because it was perfect, because it was hers. That specific, rare kind of smile that only came when she saw something others missed, like a bird nesting under the eaves, or the way June used to talk to her shoes before putting them on. It was the smile he'd buried, and now it was back. The next morning, Sam stood beside the fire with the notebook Luke had found days ago. Did Mama write this? He asked, holding it up. Luke hesitated. Yes, he said finally. She did. Sam opened to a random page, then looked up. Then why is Eden in it? Luke felt his pulse skip. What do you mean? There's a drawing, Sam said. Look. Luke took the book and turned to the page. There, sketched in uneven lines, was the outline of a woman standing beneath a pine tree. Beside it, a note in Eden's handwriting. If I ever come back, I hope it's here. It wasn't signed, but the date was 1 month before she died. Luke closed the book slowly. A hush fell over the cabin. Outside, wind moved through the branches like a sigh, and inside something deeper than belief took hold, something called knowing, not the knowing of the mind but of the heart, of the soul. That maybe, just maybe, some love refuses to die, and some names are. They had just begun to believe in stillness again when the knock came, not cautious like before, but demanding, sharp, a hand that didn't ask permission. Eden froze mid-step, a cup slipping slightly from her grasp and catching at the edge of the table. June blinked up from her sketchbook. Sam stood straight. Luke walked to the door, rifle already in hand. When he opened it, the wind surged in, and with it, a shadow from a past Eden had never wanted to see again. "Hello, Luke," the man said, tall, with leather so worn it had turned to bark, a scar over one eye, dust on his boots like he hadn't stopped moving in weeks. Behind him, 2 other men, silent, watchful, cruel-eyed. Eden stood behind Luke now, and the color had drained from her face. "Eli," she said, not a greeting but a reckoning. Luke's knuckles whitened on the stock of his rifle. "I told you she'd be here," Eli said, to no one in particular. "A woman like her don't vanish. She just finds fools to believe her." Eden stepped forward before Luke could speak. "What do you want?" Eli smiled, and it wasn't kind. "Want? You ran, lied, took something that belonged to me." "I took nothing," she said. "You took your name." The words landed like a slap. Even June looked up now, understanding more than a child should. Luke stepped between them. "You should leave." But Eli wasn't looking at Luke. He was looking at Eden, not with affection, not even hate, but with the cold calculation of someone who thought they'd won long ago. "I came to take back what's mine," he said. Eden didn't flinch. "I was never yours. You made promises to my father, not to me. You broke a marriage oath," Eli growled. and you told lies that cost men their lives." "I told the truth," she said, voice steady but shaking beneath. And for a second, just a breath, the air around them burned with something electric, like the earth itself had leaned in to listen. Eli spat at the ground. Truth's just noise when it comes from a woman who forgets her place. Luke raised the rifle then, not shaking, not bluffing. "She remembers it fine," he said. "It's just not beneath your boot." The men behind Eli stepped forward, but he raised a hand. "Not here, not now, but this ain't over." He turned, slow, deliberate. The threat hung in the wind long after their shapes disappeared into the trees. Inside the cabin, Eden sat in silence. The children clung to her now, not in fear, but in protection, as if trying to guard her from the weight in her eyes. Luke stoked the fire, but his hands were tight, angry. "He knew you'd be here," he said, more a statement than a question. "I used to think distance was enough," she replied. "I forgot how far cruelty's willing to travel." Luke sat across from her. "Tell me everything." She looked at him, eyes hollow, tired, but honest. "My father arranged the marriage, said it would keep peace between families. But Eli, he wasn't a husband. He was a jailer with a smile. He made me promise silence, even after I saw what he did. I broke that promise." "To who?" "To the sheriff, to a preacher, to anyone who would listen. But in towns like ours, a woman's truth is quieter than a man's denial." Luke clenched his jaw. "They ran me out," Eden continued. "Said I was sick in the head, that I made it up because I feared marriage." "And the name?" Luke asked. "I gave it up the night I crossed the ridge. Thought if I buried it deep enough, the danger would forget me. I didn't know. Memory keeps its own trail." She leaned back, eyes closing. "Every night since, I've wondered if I did the right thing, whether silence would have been safer." Luke looked at her, really looked. "You did the right thing," he said, "even if no one else did." She opened her eyes. "Then why does it still hurt like the wrong thing?" He didn't answer. "Because some truths aren't for solving, just for surviving." And Eden, or whatever her name had been before, had survived more than most would ever know. Later, Luke walked to the edge of the trees, scanned the footprints in the snow. Eli's boots were heavy, deep, dragging, not gone far. Waiting, planning, but Luke wasn't the same man anymore. And Eden wasn't the same woman who'd once fled into the forest alone. They had children now, not just blood but bond. They had truths too sharp to bury again. And they had fire, not just in the hearth but in their bones. That night the cabin pulsed with silence, not the warm kind that held peace, but the sharp-edged kind that followed a wound, one that hadn't yet bled out. Luke sat near the fire, watching the shadows dance across the wall. Eden was in the far corner, wrapped in a quilt, staring into the dark as if it were speaking directly to her. Sam had fallen asleep clutching a wooden carving of a horse. June lay curled beside Eden, her small hand resting gently over Eden's heart as if to steady it. Luke's thoughts spiraled. He'd known men like Eli, men who dressed their fists in charm, who knew how to make fear feel like a favor. But he hadn't known Eden's past carried such names. He hadn't known her silence came at that cost. He reached for the leather-bound notebook again, not for proof, but for grounding. The last entry had been Eden S. A single line scrawled at the top of the page, written in a rush. If he finds me, I won't run this time, not because I'm safe, because I've found something worth standing for." Luke looked up at her. "Is this still true?" he asked. Eden didn't look over. "Yes. You're not alone now." She met his eyes across the flickering shadows. "I know." The next morning, Luke pulled Sam aside. The boy was tall for his age but carried fear the way adults did, hidden beneath tasks, buried in stoic silence. "You're not responsible for what happens next," Luke told him. Sam shook his head. "But I want to help." "You will, just by being brave." Sam nodded. Luke placed a hand on his shoulder firm. "Brave doesn't mean fighting. It means not running when you want to." He didn't mention that his own legs had been itching to flee since Eli showed up. By noon, Eden stood with a rifle slung over her shoulder, eyes on the trail where Eli had disappeared. "He'll come back," she said. "I know. I won't hide again." Luke nodded. "We'll do this together." But her jaw was set differently that day, like someone who had made peace with a truth too big for sharing. She wasn't preparing for a fight. She was preparing for a reckoning. She walked to the edge of the clearing where the snow met the trees and stood there for hours, silent, still, watching. The wind tugged at her hair. The cold tried to bite, but she didn't flinch. And then, as the sun dipped, a figure emerged. Not Eli, a boy, maybe 17, thin, ragged coat, no weapons. Eden stepped forward instinctively, hand reaching for the strap across her chest. The boy raised both hands. "He sent me." Luke joined her side, rifle in hand but lowered. "He says he wants to talk," the boy stammered. "Not fight." Eden narrowed her eyes. "Where?" The boy nodded toward the ridge. "Near the gorge, sunset." "Alone?" Luke asked. He said just her. Luke growled under his breath. Eden didn't hesitate. "Fine." They walked together partway up the ridge. At the halfway point, Eden stopped and turned to Luke. "You can't follow." "The hell I can't. If this goes bad, they'll come for the cabin. You need to be there. I won't let you go alone." "You're not," she said, placing her hand over her heart. "I'm bringing everything we built with me." And with that, she kept walking. Luke watched her silhouette shrink along the snow-lined path. The same woman he had once thought broken, now walking toward the man who had once tried to own her. He didn't breathe until she disappeared beyond the trees. The sun was low, casting orange fire across the gorge when Eden arrived. Eli stood by the edge, hands tucked into his coat, eyes sharp but tired. "You came," he said. "You asked." He studied her. "You don't look scared." "I'm not. Even now, knowing what I could do." She stepped closer. "You've already done your worst. I'm just here to make sure it ends." He laughed, short and bitter. "You think standing here makes you strong." "No," she said. "But staying silent made me weak. I won't do that again." Eli's smile faded. "You ruined everything," he said. "No," Eden replied. "I survived it." He stepped forward. "You changed your name, changed your face. And you still couldn't forget me." "That's where you're wrong," she said. "I didn't forget, I forgave myself." That stopped him. The silence between them stretched, not like a threat, but like a verdict waiting to be spoken. Then Eden reached into her coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. She held it out. "What's this?" Eli asked. "The truth," she said. "In writing, witnesses, names. I left copies across 5 towns. If I don't come back, it gets mailed. Eli's hand clenched at his side. This isn't a fight you can win, she said, but it can be one you walk away from. For the first time, Eli looked small, not weak, just defeated. He stared at her a long while. They thought it was over. After the meeting at the gorge, after Eli disappeared into the trees without another word, they dared to breathe again. For a few days, the quiet returned, not the fragile silence of fear, but the deeper, sturdier stillness that comes when you believe you've outrun the storm. Luke started repairing the cabin's roof. Eden taught June how to mend socks. Sam began carving animals again. Hope returned not as a shout but as a whisper. But storms, especially the ones shaped like men, don't always pass. Some circle back when you've let your guard down. It was just past dusk. The fire burned low, supper finished. Luke stepped outside to check the traps. He heard at first a strange creak, like boot leather against floorboards. Then a sound he hadn't heard in years, the slick click of a hammer being drawn back. He turned, too late. Eli was already in the doorway, shotgun raised. Inside, Sam grabbed June and ducked behind the table. Eden stepped in front of them without hesitation. "You came back," she said. Eli's face was a mask of something far beyond rage. This wasn't about control anymore. This was about erasure. "I warned you," he said. "I gave you a choice," Eden replied. "You gave me shame," he snapped. "I came to take it back." And then everything moved too fast. Luke lunged. The gun fired, wood splintered, screams echoed. And in the chaos, Eden dropped. Blood. Too much blood. She lay near the hearth, clutching her side, eyes wide with shock. Luke tackled Eli, fists flying, fury unhinged. They crashed into chairs, shelves, the wall. Years of buried rage poured out with every strike. Eli fought back, dirty, cruel, but Luke wasn't fighting for pride. He was fighting for the people behind him. The people Eli didn't see as human. With one final shove, Luke pinned him, breath ragged, eyes wild. The rifle lay just inches away. Eli sneered, "Do it." Luke's hand hovered over the trigger. Behind him, Eden's voice weak but clear, "Don't." He didn't move. "Luke," she said again, "if you kill him, you won't be you anymore." He turned to her, her skin pale, breath shallow. "He would've," Luke's voice cracked. "I know, but if you kill him now, you let him write the ending." Luke looked back at Eli, bruised, broken, but still smirking. And then something in Luke's chest broke loose. He stood, picked up the rifle, and walked outside. Eli flinched, expecting death. But Luke didn't point it at him. Instead, he walked to the edge of the clearing, dug a hole with his bare hands, and buried the gun. Eli watched, stunned. When Luke returned, his voice was like iron. "You come near us again, I won't hesitate. But not today. Today I choose something else." Eli looked at Eden, bleeding but alive. At Sam, shielding his sister. At Luke, panting, fists bloodied but not ruined. And for once he had nothing left to say. He stumbled out into the snow, alone, small, and already fading. Luke rushed back to Eden. She was conscious, barely. He pressed cloth to the wound, trying not to panic. "You stayed," she whispered. "Of course I stayed." "You didn't kill him." "No." Her hand reached up, fingers brushing his cheek. "Good," she said. "Now we get to live." They cleaned the blood. Sewed her wound. Luke didn't sleep that night, only sat beside her, keeping the fire going, watching the rise and fall of her chest like it was the only thing that mattered in the world. When morning came, Eden handed him something wrapped in fabric. It was another rifle, not Eli's, hers. "I never meant to be helpless," she said. Luke took it, confused. "Why give this to me?" "Because you buried your gun to end a war. But keep this one not for killing, for protecting." He nodded slowly. "Do you think he'll come back?" She looked out the window. "Men like him don't disappear, but they do get smaller every time we choose differently." Luke tucked the rifle away, and they began again, not from nothing, but from everything they'd survived together. Luke never told the children what could have happened that night, not in full. He let their memories soften the edges, a loud bang, a bad man, mama hurt but okay. That was enough. But he carried it. Not like a burden, but like a fire kept just low enough to warm and never burn. Because now he understood. Some things didn't need to be forgotten. They needed to be remembered differently. The days that followed moved slower. Winter wasn't gone, but its bite had lessened. Eden healed inch by inch, a little more each sunrise. Her wound stopped bleeding before Luke's hands stopped shaking. One morning, while she rested near the window, he came to her with a piece of folded paper. A note he'd written the night she was shot, thinking it might be the last time she'd hear from him. He hadn't been ready to say the words aloud. She read it in silence, lips pressed together, tears tracing a soft path down her cheek. "I'm not her," she said gently when she finished. "I know," he replied. "I never wanted to be a shadow." "You're not." Eden held the paper close to her chest. "Then who am I, Luke?" He reached out, touching her wrist with a tenderness that was no longer unsure. "You're the woman who stayed. The one who came back, even if we don't understand how." She looked away, eyes shining. "That should scare you." "It did," he admitted, "until I realized it doesn't matter where you came from. It matters what you do with the chance to begin again." As the weeks passed, the land thawed slowly. Trees began to green. The air softened, and so did Luke. He and Eden built a new table together, sturdier, bigger, enough for guests someday. Sam helped carve the legs. June picked out wildflowers to place at the center each morning, a habit Eden taught her. They didn't talk much about the past anymore, but it lived in the way they moved around each other, aware, respectful, attuned. A rhythm rebuilt from silence and forgiveness. One evening, while tending to the garden plot Eden had started, Sam looked up and said, "Do you think people can have more than one beginning?" Eden wiped sweat from her brow. "Why do you ask?" He shrugged. "Just feels like we've had two lives, the one before Mama left and this one." Eden knelt beside him, her voice gentle. "Maybe we don't get separate lives, just chapters, some hurt more. But they're still part of the same book." Sam thought about that, then nodded. "Then I hope this chapter's longer." Eden smiled. "Me too." Luke began to write again, not for anyone but for himself. Notes in the margins of the old journal. Sketches of Eden holding June. Sam feeding the chickens. Reflections about what it meant to lose someone and then find something new, not as a replacement but as a resurrection. One entry stood out. "I once believed grief had an ending, a place where it stopped. But maybe it doesn't stop. Maybe it transforms into quiet, into peace, into love again in a different shape. He tore the page out and gave it to Eden one afternoon. She read it and didn't speak. But that night she touched his face with both hands, and when she kissed him, it wasn't out of longing or fear, it was out of recognition. Of all they had chosen, all they had survived, all they were still learning to be, spring came, not as a parade but as a slow unfurling, grass returning, rivers softening, life exhaling. One day Eden asked to visit the grave. They hadn't been back since the move to the mountains. The children stayed behind with neighbors. Luke and Eden rode together, quiet for most of the trip. The headstone was still there, weathered, moss-covered, but legible. Eden Avery. Beloved wife, devoted mother. 1862-1886. Eden knelt beside it. I always hated that it said wife before mother, she said. Luke smiled faintly. You used to say both were exhausting. She traced the name with her fingers. It's strange, seeing your name carved in stone when you still wake up each morning. Luke stood behind her. Maybe it means you left something here, but took something with you too. She placed a sprig of rosemary at the base. For remembrance, she said. Then softly, do you believe in second chances, Luke? He didn't hesitate. I live with one every day. She reached up, took his hand. And for a long moment, the three of them, the past, the present, the love in between, stood there, held together by silence, memory, and the breathless beauty of having survived. They rode home without speaking much. There was nothing more to say. That night, as Eden tucked June into bed and Luke leaned in to kiss Sam's forehead, the wind outside hummed a familiar tune. Not sorrow, not warning, just life, whispering that it was moving forward. And for once, Luke didn't brace against it. He welcomed it, because he knew now, love wasn't what you kept. It was what you. The snow had melted. The earth, once hard and unyielding, now gave easily under their boots. Life returned to the mountain in bursts, green shoots, birdsong, and the steady warmth of a spring that didn't ask for permission. Inside the cabin, the light had changed too. Softer, not filtered through caution anymore, but through comfort, through trust. Eden stood by the window one morning, watching the sun inch across the hills, when Sam approached with something clutched tight to his chest. I made you something, he said, trying to sound casual but failing to hide the shy pride in his voice. She knelt to his level, brushing hair from his forehead. What is it? He handed her a drawing done in charcoal, smudged in places but careful. It showed their cabin, the mountains behind it, and four stick figures out front. One tall man with a hat, one boy holding a carved horse, a girl with pigtails, and a woman central, smiling, holding both children's hands. Beneath it, in his careful, slightly crooked handwriting, Mama and Home. Eden stared at the paper, her lips parting slightly. Her fingers trembled not from cold, but from the weight of something she'd never dared to name. They call me Eden, she said quietly, but that wasn't always my name. Sam tilted his head. What was it? Imara. He frowned. I don't like that as much. She smiled gently. Me neither. Why'd you change it? Eden looked out the window, thought a moment. Because Mara meant bitterness. It was who I was when I was running, but Eden's a garden. A beginning, it's who I hope to be. Sam nodded slowly as if that made perfect sense, then pointed at the drawing. Then that's your name. She pulled him into a hug, holding him close, heart beating hard against his ear. It was the first time she felt like the name Eden didn't just belong to someone she was trying to become. It belonged to someone already here. That evening they all sat outside. The air was cool, but not sharp. The sky turned the color of soft bruises, lavender, blue, silver. Luke handed her a mug of tea, their fingers brushing. "You told him," he said. She nodded. "I needed him to know the truth. But I also needed him to know it wasn't who I am anymore." Luke stared into the distance. "Names don't make a person," he said finally, "but sometimes they make it easier to be seen." As she turned to him, "So, who do you see?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached for her hand, lacing their fingers. "I see home," he said. Eden didn't speak. She couldn't. The ache in her chest wasn't pain. It was release. It was belonging. Later that night, as she folded blankets and blew out lanterns, she paused in the doorway of the children's room. June whispered in her sleep, "Mama." And Eden stood there, hand against the frame, eyes full. That word, once a wound, now a gift. Not earned by blood, but by presence, by staying, by choosing again and again to be there when it mattered, to be called something not because the past demanded it, but because the present invited it. Eden. A name not given, but grown into. A name that meant, at last, she was no longer lost. The next morning, while the dew still clung to the grass and the birds had barely begun their songs, Eden walked alone to the stream behind the cabin. She carried no basket, no task, just herself and a folded scrap of paper she'd kept for years, worn, nearly faded, but still legible. On it was a line she'd once copied from a book in a town long forgotten. "A name is not a tether, it's a direction." She'd read it in hiding, after her escape, back when she still flinched at footsteps and couldn't sleep through the wind, back when Mara felt like both a curse and a tether to everything she had endured. Changing her name had not erased the past, but it had given her permission to walk towards something else. Now, years later, with June's laughter echoing through the trees and Luke whistling near the barn, Eden realized something she hadn't been ready to before. She didn't need the paper anymore. She knelt by the water, let it touch her fingertips, then unfolded the scrap and laid it on the current. It floated for a moment, catching light before disappearing downstream. Not a loss, a release. Behind her, soft footsteps. "Luke, you okay?" he asked. She stood, nodded. "I let her go," she said. He didn't ask who she meant. He only stepped closer, touched her shoulder, and said, "Then let's keep walking forward." They turned back toward the cabin together. That evening, as dusk wrapped the mountain in gentle blues and the fire crackled low, Eden sat by the hearth while June brushed her hair. A ritual she'd invented, one stroke for every good dream they wanted to have. "Can I ask you something?" June said sleepily. "Anything." "Did you used to be someone else?" Eden paused, then smiled. "Yes," she said, "but I think I was always trying to be who I am now." June nodded, satisfied, and nestled into her lap. And Eden, looking down at this child not born of her, but of the life she'd chosen, felt no need to correct her, no desire to explain further. She was Eden now. Not just because she'd taken the name, but because she'd lived it day by day until it felt like a garden blooming where grief once grew. A begin The night was quiet, the kind of quiet that only comes after a long, hard season. In the corner of the room, the fire burned low, steady, gentle, like a breath rather than a roar. Eden sat with June nestled against her side, Sam on the rug at her feet, both children heavy-lidded, sleep teasing the edges of their thoughts. She spoke softly, her voice a thread that stitched the air together. "There was once a flame," she began, "not the kind that destroys, but the kind that glows. It lived deep in the forest, inside a lantern no one could find. Some said it belonged to a woman who lost everything, but still walked each night with the light held in front of her, not to burn, but to guide." Sam's head tilted. Did she find what she was looking for? Eden smiled, brushing hair from his brow. She didn't have to. The flame showed her that walking was enough. June yawned. "That's a nice kind of fire." Eden leaned down and kissed her forehead. "The best kind." Soon the children slept, their breathing slow and certain. Luke remained in the corner, watching the last flickers of flame dance over the logs. He didn't speak, didn't move. Just sat with the quietness inside him, a quietness that no longer felt hollow. He looked at Eden as she tucked the quilt around June. Her eyes caught the light, and for a second he thought of his wife not with ache, but with something else. Gratitude. He'd loved her and always would. But Eden was not a replacement. She was something altogether different. She was the part of him that remembered how to feel again. The warmth after the frost, the path after the collapse. She was the flame, not the fire. The porch creaked beneath their feet as morning stretched its golden arms across the ridge. June laughed, full, unguarded, chasing Sam with a pinecone in her hand. Their boots left shallow prints in the soft snow, their joy ringing through the crisp mountain air. Eden sat on the steps, a quilt wrapped around her shoulders, eyes squinting into the light. The kind of squint that comes not from discomfort but disbelief, that life could be this gentle again. Luke emerged from the cabin with 2 steaming cups of coffee. He handed one to her, their fingers brushing just enough to say more than words could. They sat in silence for a while, watching the children. The firewood stacked, the roof mended, the world for this brief and fragile moment intact. Luke took a sip, then asked without looking at her, "Do you regret it?" Eden didn't answer immediately. She let the warmth of the cup seep into her palms, then turned to him, a soft, quiet smile breaking across her face. "No," she said, "that was the best $3 I ever took." He chuckled under his breath, and they sat there, side by side, not with the weight of what had been lost, but with the fullness of what had found them. Because sometimes, a new life doesn't begin with plans or promises. It begins with a voice you recognize, and a